room for you to attend without registrations. And each of these panels will address one of the thematic tracks of the Geneva Peace Week. And today, this high-level panel is organized by the GCSP. I also wanted to mention that this afternoon we are welcoming the Radio Corner, which is a live recording which has been brought to us by Fondation Hirondelle, Peace, and the Radio-Télévision Suisse Romande, Geneva Vision. So they will hold different interviews next to us, in a room next to us, and for the whole afternoon. So before we start this panel, I would like to briefly introduce our panelists. To my immediate, to my, let's say, far left, I would say, he is Royal Highness Prince Zayed Rad Al Hussein, who is the president of the International Peace Institute. We have also Mrs. Elizabeth Spihar, who will join us online, who is the Assistant Secretary General for Peacebuilding Support at the United Nations. She will join us later online. To my immediate left, we have Ambassador Thomas Greminger. You heard him already this morning, who is the Director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy. To my immediate right, actually, that was my left, so voila. We have Mrs. Jolie Ruth Moran, who is a project coordinator at DCAF. We also heard this morning about DCAF, who is in charge of the Sub-Saharan Africa Division. And we have Dr. Adam Day, director of the UN University Center for Policy Research in Geneva. So we heard this morning from the different panelists that people around the world seek to navigate ongoing and emerging volatile conflicts, compounded by climate crisis, struggling economies, and protracted corona pandemic. And within this context, the UN Secretary General is preparing a new agenda for peace. This high-level panel will concentrate on the content of this new agenda for peace and will reflect on what it should contain, what it promises, and whether or not we can make it operational. The first panelist will be Prince Zayed. So, Prince Zayed, throughout your career, you have acquired immense expertise in international policy matters. So in the current international context of acute turbulence and polarization, what new efforts and initiatives are required to enable peace?
Well, first of all, Anissa, thank you so much for the warm introduction. I'm delighted, together with my colleagues at the International Peace Institute, to be here and thank the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform and GCSP for this panel, but also just for the week to be spent back in Geneva. When I last left Geneva, I think there were many governments happy to see me go. I'm glad to see that I can still work with many of them. So I'm going to then focus on two or three things that I think need to be included in the new agenda for peace. The first issue, which to my mind is absolutely essential, and it came from a discussion I had with a former chef de cabinet to two secretaries general. And a very thoughtful comment was made to me when he stressed that the organization is rapidly separating itself from the charter. And one can make the argument that when you look at the articles now that have either been rendered defunct or are no longer observed, you don't have to just focus on Article 2.4 and the Russian aggression on Ukraine. There are so many that are almost spent without meaning. And this lack of discipline, not just by the member states, but by the Secretariat itself, is weakening the organization and correspondingly weakening every aspect of the organization's work. And in this respect, one has to bear in mind Articles 100 and 101, and there has to be a sort of readmission of how important the Charter is if you're going to build anything upon it or extend beyond it. It would also create for the organization a sense of the importance of moral consistency. The organization is no longer morally consistent. Now, you can make that argument of many organizations. It's really hard to expect it from member states to actually act ethically or act morally in a way that draws the respect and admiration of people. But the Secretariat has an obligation to do it, absolutely to stick with it. You know, it cannot be the case that you have women in Iran risking their lives day after day, and the voice of the UN Secretariat is barely audible in this respect, barely audible. Right? How can you generate the sort of respect for an organization if that's the case? And ultimately, this point also needs to be stressed. We need an organization that is not loved or liked or in the friendship business. It needs an organization that is respected, an organization that's clear, an organization that when it's clear, then creates a space for itself when it comes to peacemaking. So if we take the original Agenda for Peace, peacemaking was a central focus of it. It's now all but almost disappeared. You know? And why is that the case? There are many reasons for it, but part of it is that the detachment from the Charter, and that has to be re-engaged. The Secretariat, I mean, this point I used to make quite often when I was High Commissioner. The UN is only a reflection of the world out there, especially in the intergovernmental space. If out there it's terrible, the UN is going to be in terrible shape. The difference comes from the way the Secretariat behaves at the margins. And just by nudging it in this direction or that, it can make a difference, but it has to nudge. The nudging has to happen. There has to be sort of a precision in thinking as well. The other part, the second part of the Agenda for Peace, original Boutros Ghali's Agenda for Peace, was peace building. But we've seen now for the last 25 years, it's peace building built on cement. You know, train officials, build infrastructure, you know. And all the issues that were discussed this morning are not part of the whole discussion. The mental space, the disparate narratives, the lies, the trying to organize some sort of facility for the judgment of history. It's not true that history is a negotiation without end. You know, history, by and large, is settled. The details can be subject to a disagreement. I proposed many years ago that the UN needs to have a historical service, which enables and helps countries to find a way to settle their historical narratives. So precision is important in the way that this has to be done. And finally, because I've spoken too long, I think the stage by which we need to approach this is threefold. Stop the backsliding along the lines I've just mentioned, right? Make sure you're morally consistent in all the messages. If you're going to talk about the sort of inability of countries to overcome vested interests for the sake of climate change, or for the sake of offsetting climate change, or doing the right thing when it comes to preventing the next pandemic, you've got to do it with the large countries as well. Moral consistency across the board, and from that you can build out. Finally, the existential threats are, of course, clear to everyone. No one needs to sort of build it out further. But also the opportunities that exist within that space are phenomenal. And it's just actually trying to study where the weaknesses are and then filling in the gaps. But thank you very much, Anissa, for having me on board.
Thank you very much, Prince Zaid, for these initial thoughts. Let me turn now to Mrs. Pirhar. So I think we might connect online. Yes, here you are. Mrs. Pirhar, as we just said, the UN Secretary General has been preparing this new agenda for peace. Could you tell us a bit more of what is envisaged and in this new agenda for peace, and what may or should it entail?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be with you as well. Good afternoon to all of those of you in Geneva. I want to thank the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform and the Geneva Center for Security Policy for convening this particular panel, which is of course extremely important for those of us in the Secretariat grappling with how we move forward on the new agenda for peace. I do regret not being able to be with you in person, but I hope that perhaps next year I can join the Geneva Peacebuilding platform. In terms of what it should contain, what we need, and the ways forward, I wanted to start with just giving people a bit of an idea of how the process will unfold in the coming period, which I think is important for all of you to know, and then go a little bit into what are some of the things that perhaps it should include. So in terms of the new agenda for peace and where it sits in the broader context right now, I think it's quite clear that the SG proposed this new agenda for peace because he was very concerned about the state of affairs of the world. And it sounds like yesterday in your panels, you did quite a thorough review of some of the critical challenges. In fact, the converging and the compounding challenges that we see in many parts of the world. He also brought forward this idea of a new agenda for peace in his Our Common Agenda document last year, because as Prince Said was very clearly mentioning, he was concerned about a multilateral system and a UN that was perhaps no longer fit for purpose. No longer fit for purpose because of these seemingly insurmountable challenges we're facing in the world today, including the growing climate emergency and so many other things, but also because multilateralism has been put under increasing strain. If we look back to 1992, when Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali put out the first agenda for peace, it was a very different time. It was a period of the end of the Cold War, and there was really quite a sense of optimism that we would finally be able to use the Charter in the way that it was intended to maintain international peace and security and to work on collectively solving a range of problems that the world was facing. Obviously, we have a very different environment today, where we have increasing geostrategic competition. We have more and more countries and others who very clearly in their actions and not just in their words are disregarding the Charter, the foundational principles and values that we should all hold very dear. So this new agenda for peace is an attempt to try to somehow correct this. I think it will be a challenge because we, I believe, need to do two things. We need to have an ambitious new agenda for peace at the same time as it has to be sufficiently realistic to get the support and the consensus of the member states. So very quickly in terms of the format, and then some of what it could or should contain. So there are a number of entities of the UN system that the SG has asked to take the lead on preparing this document. It's the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, the Department of Peace Operations, the Office of Disarmament, and the Office of Counterterrorism, and they are expected to work with over 20 other UN entities, including, of course, many of those based in Geneva. So from the leadership in the UN of this process, you can already get a certain idea of where the thrust will be. We have a bit of time to do, I think, a good job on this in the sense that this document is supposed to feed into the Summit of the Future that will be at heads of state and government level in September 2024. So that means that there should be quite a bit of scope for a lot of consultation. And indeed, that is the idea. Member states are being asked for written inputs as we speak. There will be consultations on an individual and regional basis of member states, but also outreach to regional organizations, civil society, think tanks, and so forth. And there's going to be a particular attempt to make sure that we are hearing voices from all parts of the world, not just let's say, a Western or a Northern perspective, but a much, much broader global perspective. So the idea is that we could come up with a new agenda for peace by, let's say, June of next year, which will be ahead of a preparatory ministerial meeting for the Summit of the Future, and then the summit in 2024, as I mentioned, which is supposed to come out with a concise pact for the future with member state commitments and pronouncement on the way forward. So what is it that this new agenda for peace should include? I mean, the SG has already given us a number of hints of what he thinks should be in there. He mentioned 6 basic areas: reducing strategic risks, strengthening international foresight and capacities to identify and adapt to new risks, reshaping responses to all forms of violence, investing in prevention and peace building, supporting regional prevention, and putting women and girls at the center of security policy. So in all of that, I wanted to mention several aspects, and also make a mention of how all of you might be able to contribute. First of all, I have to say that I do agree very much with Prince Zaid that one of the key things is to make sure that the member states recommit to the values and principles of the institution, which he quite rightly pointed out has really been weakened in the last number of years. I think we need to recommit to the Charter, in particular to the Chapter 6 tools, and see how those can be revitalized and used much more effectively. Then there are 2 other aspects that I just wanted to highlight. One is the SG's call for investing more in prevention and peace building, and that prevention and peace building should be at the center of the new agenda for peace. I would slightly disagree with Prince Zaid in the sense that I do not believe that peace building, as not only the UN, but many others are, if you will, practicing it or supporting it, is only about concrete. I can assure you that in the work that we do, there are very important strands of looking at access to justice, human rights, inclusion, and other various elements of sustainable peace that go far beyond just buildings, bricks and mortar, and training for civil servants. But we can certainly do much more and better, and I would love to see how many of you can contribute to this to these preparations. So what I would put to you in terms of prevention and peace building, it would be great to have some fresh thinking on how we can invest more in prevention and peace building politically, operationally, and financially. Secondly, I want to go back to the issue of inclusion. Again, the SG talked in his Our Common Agenda about the new agenda for peace, putting women and girls at the center. This is obviously not only the right thing to do, it's a smart thing to do. That would be putting over half of the world's population in the center of our work on peace and security, and ensuring not only their participation, but also their leadership. I also think we need to make sure that the youth peace and security agenda resonates in the new agenda for peace, and that more broadly we are looking at inclusion of all of the vulnerable and marginalized groups that have been up until now quite absent from this field. What that means is, and this goes back to Prince Zaid's former occupation, that we need to also put human rights more broadly at the center. Human rights issues should be pivotal within the new agenda for peace. And in terms of what you can do and your contribution, here's where I think we really need also your advocacy. So to recall another point of Prince Zaid, he said that the Secretariat has to nudge the member states on these and many other issues. Fully agree, but I also look to all of you the NGOs, the think tanks, the activists, and so forth to also nudge us in the Secretariat. We all need to do this together. There cannot be one narrow set of voices helping to prepare this new agenda for peace. Let me end here, and I look forward to your comments and views. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Pihar. I now turn to you, Ambassador Greminger. So this morning you highlighted, you shared your reflections on the key challenges to international peace and security. You talked about the fact that we are now living a Cold War 2.0. And we heard just now that it seems to be that we are also living in some sort of a failure of the United Nations to live up to their ethical and moral standards, and even the need to recommit to the United Nations Charter's principle. In that context, I would be curious to hear about your views on this new agenda for peace, and what can the GCSP, the organization you're leading, do in that context?
Well, thank you. Is it working? Yes, it is. Thank you very much, Anissa. Indeed, I talked this morning about the war in Ukraine, and I argued that business as usual isn't the right thing to do under current circumstances, but no business at all isn't an option either. And I would argue that to solve today's challenges to international peace and security, we indeed need a strong and vibrant multilateral system, and we definitely need a strong and vibrant United Nations. And against this backdrop, we are at the GCSP very pleased to organize this conversation this afternoon, making peace possible, what is new on the new agenda for peace. If we look at the subtopics of this year's Geneva Peace Week, addressing environmental challenges, promoting digital peace, strengthening rights and equalities for peace, and exploring ways to move beyond securitization, I would argue all would fall within the realm of the emerging new agenda for peace. Assistant Secretary General Elisabeth Spehar just enlightened us on the UN's perspective, on the rationale, the contents and the process for this new agenda for peace. And I think this is extremely useful to get such a comprehensive picture at the outset of the Geneva Peace Week. So thank you very much, Elisabeth, for providing us with this picture. I think at the time when we witnessed the spread of aggressive nationalism, when we see that the logic of war has the upper hand, the UNSC's initiative to launch a process to redefine and reinvigorate the agenda, a peace agenda, is at the same time very timely, but also, of course, extremely challenging. We at the GCSP work on specific topics or angles in all 6 plus 1 core areas of the new agenda for peace. And I would like in the next few minutes share with you 4 specific examples of where we believe there is a new element in the new peace agenda, and where we see potential game changers in order to build a more peaceful future. I will briefly talk about promoting digital peace, reducing strategic risk, the need for strategic anticipation, and also about putting women and girls at the center. My first point is about ensuring the development of a peaceful, secure, and sustainable use of outer space. The head of our geopolitics and outer space program at the GCSP, Naif Al-Rodan, spoke at the UN high-level meeting dedicated to outer space just a couple of days ago. And he made an important point. I would like to quote him. He said, if outer space becomes critically unsafe, it will not be selectively unsafe, but unsafe for everyone, end of quote. And that building and ensuring digital peace in outer space is no longer just a question for the future. We became aware only last week when, for the first time, the war in Ukraine triggered threats for taking the war to outer space by attacking and shooting civilian satellites down. This leads me to a second core area in the new agenda for peace. That is, of course, not new in general, but perhaps it is new in its accelerating complexity and in its multi-dimensional interrelatedness. And that is the need to reduce strategic risks. We urgently need to reinvigorate and reconceptualize the disarmament agenda against the backdrop of this Cold War 2.0 that we are entering in. We need to reinvigorate how we approach the prevention of violent extremism and counterterrorism. How do we strengthen digital peace for the public good while preventing the spread of dark technologies? And see, in essence, how do we build peace by strengthening cybersecurity for all? And how can we keep pace with emerging disruptive technologies, and in particular, by effectively regulating the use of artificial intelligence and more specifically, lethal autonomous weapons systems. New technologies are already transforming the way in which wars are fought, and I think we need to become much better in using them to building sustainable peace. And clearly, when we talk about emerging disruptive technologies, prevention is key. And this leads me to the third area of what I think is extremely new in the new agenda for peace, and that is this need to develop and strengthen our capacities for strategic foresight and anticipation. With rapid changes, recurrent shocks to the international system through things like the COVID pandemic or the war in Ukraine, developing our abilities to better anticipate coming risks and threats is absolutely critical. And it is critical if we want to strengthen resilience of communities, of companies, and countries alike. We at the GCSP have been developing capacity building for strategic anticipation. We have also worked with the Executive Office of the UN Secretary General on early initiatives to strengthen organizational ability to scan and look beyond the immediate horizon of unfolding events. And we are definitely keen to continue to do so. Fourthly, the imperative of putting women and girls at the center is on the new agenda for peace, but obviously not new. It has been over 20 years since the Women, Peace and Security Agenda was first adopted. And indeed, much has been achieved, but there is still much more to be done. And in some areas, unfortunately, we are currently witnessing backtracking. Working on strengthening women's participation in peace processes remains a top priority. At the GCSP, we are proud to host the International Gender Champion Secretariat. This so-called IGC platform is one concrete tool and network to keeping the focus on the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. Finally, one topic that has not, at least not explicitly, been included in the new agenda for peace so far is our peace operations. And UN peace operations, specifically the large multidimensional ones, are currently experiencing potentially game-changing challenges. Challenges to both their presence and their operations in a number of countries and contexts. Because of these possibly existential challenges to peace operations, including those generated in cyberspace and through dark technologies, there is an urgent need to revisit what peace operations can or cannot do, should or should not attempt, and how they are best configured and delivered. In conclusion, it is my strong belief that we can only achieve sustainable peace through collaborative approaches to building peace and through cooperative security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Graminger. I note here indeed this new aspect of the new agenda for peace to make sure that the outer space is safe for everyone, to reinvigorate the disarmament agenda, especially with regard to what has happened today in the context of the war in Ukraine and the Cold War 2.0, and also the need to ensure to really reinforce the place of women and girls at the center of peace-building initiatives and operations. So now I'm turning to you, Jolie Ruth Moran. You have vast field experience, and you actually represent an organization which has vast field operations, DCAF. Here in Geneva, we also take pride of the fact that we somehow are at the intersection between the field, Geneva here, some headquarters, but also to this relationship with New York. We would be interested to hear your views about how your experience in the field would highlight what is important or not, in your views, in this new agenda for peace.
Thank you so much. The first question for me is, after the first new agenda for peace that was there 20 years ago, and for some of you who know the African Union commitment to silence the guns by 2020, how far are we today? But what did we learn? How come today we're again saying that we didn't move forward? Maybe something that we are missing is the way we learn or we do not learn from the past or from our mistakes or the way we do business. The other question for me is working in the Sahel. People in Gao, Timbuktu, the communities, how are they going to input in this agenda? Who is going to bring their voices to this? Who are we talking to? Who represent them? This is the question. This is really the question we need to tackle. Maybe we go to the capitals and talk to the minister, the prime minister, but his view or solutions are different from the communities, from women's voices, young voices. So for what I take is that we need really to listen to those who are facing insecurity, wherever they are, because they have a voice, they know what are their needs and their priorities. What in DCAF, work in the Sahel we take is that for this conflict-affected context, we need to be agile. We need to look at how we do the work, the tools that we are using, and also, especially if you look at in Mali, Burkina Faso, now that we have had 2 military coups, Mali in less than 1 year, Burkina Faso the same. So are we going to continue to do business as usual? We need to take time to reflect. And flexibility is something which is very important, because if we come with our action plan, programs, and we're not really able to adjust the way we're doing things, we're going to be really stuck. But also taking time to understand the context, the root causes. What are the root causes for insecurity? Do we take time to address those ones? And who are the people who have the power? Who are the protagonists in there? Who are they? So this is where, who has the influence? Because this is also highly political. This is where we're going to know with who pushes where, but also without keeping in mind that we have at some point to bring everybody around the table. But also understanding the assessing again and again our assumptions. For those working in the Sahel, when there was a military coup, we were asking, hi, did you see it coming? And we're there. So maybe listening, taking time to assess, but also to listen and then to see that, okay, things are changing. Let's adjust our way of, the way we intervene. But also the political elite we are talking to have their own understanding of the situation and their own solutions, which are different from the other people who are living really in the context of insecurity. So this requires us to adopt approaches that are going, if listening to everybody means that we have to adopt approaches that are going to be really put the population in the center of the work that we're doing. Otherwise, it's going to be those usual suspects we talk to who are in the capitals, forgetting that when we talk about security, we talk about security for each and everyone. So taking time to talk to everybody and make sure that their concerns and needs are also taken into account is something which is crucial to make sure that expectations and views of the population are taken into account. So putting the population in the middle of the work that we do in terms of human rights, in terms of inclusivity, in terms of good governance, everything that we do has to be people-centered. We have been talking about prevention. What are the tools that we have today? Maybe we need to revisit our tools and our language. Prevention for violent extremism. The UN had a program, we had all the nice program to fight against violence, extremism. Did it work? Maybe this is not, this is something we have to look into, but question also our way of intervention and our language. But also we need to look at partner institutions and actors who are around to see who are the change agents. In each and every community, there are change agents. Maybe empowering those change agents is that which is going to bring long-term and sustainable peace. Peace won't come from Geneva. Peace in Mali, peace in Niger or elsewhere won't come from Geneva or New York. It's going to be people who are there, living there are the ones. So how are we empowering them? Who are those people within the society who are going to to bring peace in their own communities. Talking to women. Maybe it takes time to go to find those ones, not those usual suspect NGOs we find in the capitals. Huh? Maybe not those ones. Maybe others, to take time to understand the context, to understand really who is going to bring that change and sustainable peace we are talking about. Another question is, we have been talking about peace. I know I have 5 minutes, but I will be very short. So we have been talking about the Sahel, violent extremism, but today we are seeing military coup coming again and again. Maybe tomorrow there will be another one. What are we doing? Is this the model which is coming back? Are we going to address this or not? Is our work still relevant when there is a military government? How are we doing the business without being used? How are we doing? How are we going to continue to use, to do our job, peace-building work, without giving legitimacy to the junte militaire? So this is a question. Or are we going just to say that we are withdrawing? Some of you know that those who have been working in Gambia, Niger, Gambia, Mali, Burkina Faso, some of international partners said, okay, we stop. This is when the population, this is when we are needed. Our work is still relevant, but how are we going to do it? How are we going to do it? So it's really, we have a lot of questions coming we'll have to address. But addressing these questions will be, again, finding the solutions from inside, but finding also, during this transitional period, resilient people who are going to continue to fight, to make sure that human rights, justice, good governance remains on the agenda. The solution is not to say, I'm withdrawing. Then we lose what we have been doing for years. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Moran. I think we really hear you in this audience, that we do need to ensure that the population's voice, everyone's voice, is actually heard, not just theoretically, but to find proper procedures, proper ways to include these voices in this new agenda for peace. Otherwise, it's just going to repeat the same story again and again. And it will be business as usual, despite the new wars, despite the coup d'etat, as you said. And this cannot go on if we want peace to be possible, indeed. Now I turn to our last speaker, Dr. Adam Day. So, Dr. Day, you're the head of the UN University Center for Policy Research, and you have worked for many years on these different issues. Our fellow panelists discussed also how today the UN seems to have, and the whole international systems, including states, seems to have provoked somehow the failure of multilateralism. What is your view on this, Adam?
Thanks so much, and thanks to GPP and GCSP. UN University is delighted to be here in Geneva and to be part of this conversation. I wanted to just make a few comments responding to that question from the point of view of someone who worked on the Common Agenda drafting process and on the new Agenda for Peace directly, and also we continue at UN University to support one of the highest priority initiatives out of the Common Agenda, which is the High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism, where we're looking at some of those big pictures, although maybe not quite to the level of outer space. And I think I just want to emphasize this starting point for the Agenda for Peace that Thomas mentioned. Really, in the early 90s, there was such an incredible cooperation within the Security Council on many issues. You have 200 new resolutions come out in the first few years, 15 new peace operations created, and a real sense of optimism about what could be done. And the Agenda for Peace really comes out of that moment, and I don't think that it could be done today if you tried to write the Agenda for Peace today, per se. And really, the moment today is almost the polar opposite of that moment. I mean, you have no ability to cooperate on those strategic issues. I'd say the realm of cooperation in the Security Council has been reduced to 3 issues, which is rolling over the mandates of existing peacekeeping, some cooperation around UN sanctions, and a little bit of cooperation around counterterrorism, and very little. And if you look at the new Agenda for Peace, as Zaid pointed out, actually, there's almost no mention of peacemaking in it. There's very little instances we can point out to where the UN is playing a central role in peacemaking, maybe prevention, maybe post-conflict peace building, or peace building even in a pre-conflict setting, and almost no mention of peacekeeping. And so if you think about where the emphasis is in the original Agenda for Peace and where it is now, there's a significant difference. And I think if you think of the Common Agenda as thinking of 2 scenarios, and it doesn't offer a third one, it offers a breakdown or a breakthrough, today we're already living in the breakdown in the peace and security realm. And so I think there's a risk that we self-censor in this context and kind of throw up our hands and say, well, the Overton window of political possibility is so narrow, how much can we actually get done? And keeping going over and over again how bad the context is tends to reinforce how tough it is to get things done, and that there's very little political will to do the big lift. I think it's worth starting with the word crisis, and it comes from the Greek word for decision, and that actually these moments of crisis can provoke the types of decisions that you might not be able to make in a moment where there isn't such an acute crisis. And so for me, the question is really, rather than starting with the question of what's possible or what's new about the new Agenda for Peace, ask how can the new Agenda for Peace open up that Overton window a bit more and create a new political possibility that might not have existed without this crisis. And I just want to flag quickly 4 areas where I think there is scope to push a bit. And the obvious one is nuclear weapons, called strategic weapons, a little bit of a euphemism in the Common Agenda. But if you think about the Agenda for Peace in the early 90s, strategic weapons weren't even mentioned. Now, I would say it's at the top of the agenda, and one news article that could come up on our phones any minute could change the entire security dynamic globally immediately. And I think it's important to think what has worked. The NPT has held for 70 years, but it's a structure that can come down very quickly without some sort of serious reaffirmation and without it being used to build a greater sense of confidence and transparency. And the START Treaty is barely hanging together. And I think some of the proposals that we've heard coming in now from the huge number of consultations that we've done around the Common Agenda is that there are initiatives around building transparency, building a better sense of citizen accountability for existential risks like this, that I think may now be the moment to push hard on those. And so I do think that we tend to think of nuclear as this thing that's kind of parked in this impossible realm. It is very possible. It needs some set of decisions now, and I think that there is a scope for that first pillar of the new Agenda for Peace to take it on. The second one comes from, I think, Thomas said we aren't keeping pace. I think that's a great way to describe how poorly the system is positioned to deal with emerging risks. And the Common Agenda actually came out of the SG's frustration at not being able to respond quickly enough to the pandemic. But if you look at climate-driven security risks, you look at livelihood loss, human mobility, AI risks, Thomas mentioned some of the new technologies, and you get into very specific issues like lethal autonomous weapon systems and AI-driven bio risks. The system is not well calibrated to pre-position action in those. And I think that Simon Gimson this morning talked about the nonviolent management of risks. That's a really great phrase that I think captures some of the initiatives in the Common Agenda. Some, if you look at the word foresight, it shows up several times in the Common Agenda and in the new Agenda for Peace. The SG is creating an entity called the Futures Lab, which is meant to do scenario-based future analysis. And I think pairing this foresight capacity with entities that can act in the case of elevating risks. Some of the interesting proposals we've heard is a joint assessment mechanism around unknown biological risks. There's a process that's being proposed around ethical development of AI. There could be a moment for that. And certainly the SG's initiative around a preparedness platform that definitely comes out of the pandemic moment. I think now's the moment, and if there's a big theme in the common agenda in general, it's the word future. And how do you actually position around future when much of the system feels very reactive, and certainly the Security Council does. The third, I think, points to this question that you raised about Timbuktu not being able to speak in the multilateral system. I think the lack of inclusion in the multilateral system is probably the biggest crisis. And this goes at a lot of different levels, but if you look at the Security Council's inability to respond to Syria and Yemen and Ukraine, part of that is a diminishment of legitimacy, but it's also because the system is being instrumentalized by a small group of states. So if you look at Biden's speech in the General Assembly this year, opening the door in principle to Security Council reform, Minister Lavrov made similar comments in Africa. It's important to remember that the Security Council has been reformed in the past. It has had its membership expanded. It is not a totally new idea, and there's a good degree of pessimism out there, but I think the need for change is extremely obvious. It is being echoed in all quarters. It could be the type of crisis like Ukraine that could actually prompt a shift. And I just want, since Zaid has mentioned a few UN Charter articles, I'll mention Article 109, which was an article that came out of the process for giving the P5 veto power. And it was a promise, essentially, that in return for getting veto power, within 10 years, there would be a General Assembly discussion around the Council. That never happened because of the Cold War, so it's an unfulfilled promise within the Charter that could be used for having a serious discussion within the General Assembly about Council reform. But I think absent Council reform, there's a lot of other interesting ideas around improving inclusion in the multilateral system. Could you include major companies that are responsible for AI development in that process to create an ethics and global governance around AI? Could cities that are in the front line of a lot of the peace and security issues and environmental issues be more meaningfully included in the system, including through a special status? And then there's a whole range of ways of bringing non-state actors. There's one proposal is to have a civil society envoy to create a kind of champion for civil society. But I think there's a lot of ideas now, and I'd say the biggest number of conversations that are happening around the common agenda in general, but also the new agenda for peace has to do with inclusion. And I think having Elizabeth here with the peace building architecture, that's another entry point. And so inclusion, I think, this is the moment to be serious about it. There are other areas that Elizabeth mentioned around regionalism and doing regional prevention that I think are really important to think through. Is now the moment to create a new relationship between the multilateral system and regional organizations that's less tactical, less focused on just pouring a bit of money into, for example, African Union-led peacekeeping, and more strategic, taking into account that bigger range of risks that you were talking about. So I'm not an optimist per se in all of these areas, but I think it is important to understand that there is a kind of ripeness to some of these questions in the new agenda for peace. And the final point really is, one of the ways of thinking about this whole thing is to imagine this conversation in 2045. And imagine what would a breakthrough scenario look like by the time we get to the 100-year anniversary of the UN. It could be the system looks very different than it looks today. And I would imagine that one of the key initiatives between now and 2045 is to make the system look a lot more like a cobweb, to use a term that was used this morning, and a lot less like a 38-floor building with a lot of security passes in it. And the UN playing much more of a connective role across existing actors, and a lot less about having closed spaces with mahogany tables with a few people making decisions about a country like Syria. So those would be my thoughts for how to contextualize the new agenda for peace. And I hope the optimism isn't too unrealistic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Day. I hear that indeed there is a lot on the shoulder, I think, of the team behind the new agenda for peace, in particular to reinforce this anticipatory dimension that actually also Thomas mentioned, that it is important that the UN not only lives up to its standards, but also tries not to be to react only, but to proact, if I may say, in provision of what may come. And we have failed, indeed, if we see what is happening now in terms of climate change, in terms of pandemics, and so on and so forth. So let's hope, indeed, that the new Agenda for Peace will be able to proact rather than react. Now I will open the floor to the public. For a few questions, we do have a little bit of time for questions. Please introduce yourself when you ask a question, and keep it a question rather than a comment, so that we have the time to gather a few of these. And also perhaps you can ask the question to a particular person. Yes, please, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Does it work?
We can hear you.
Yes, it does.
Thank you very much. I'm Christophe Barbet. I'm main representative here at United Nations for the Center for Global Non-Killing. When we talk about policy, we don't talk about what the world is. We don't talk about what needs to be done. We talk about what we want to do. When we wrote the Constitution in Geneva, I was asked to do an inventory 10 years ago, of all the places we could put concrete peace in a constitution. Well, there are the institutions or the nation states, some within internal, some without external. To make it short, there's a lot we can do on constitution, but there's a lot we can do for the people. There are institutions and the people. The right to peace, I mentioned just to mention. How much in this future plan do you introduce internal peaceful resolution of disputes?
At the entrance.
That's not me. Okay, I
Please
take it again.
go ahead.
Yes. Resolution of disputes is mandatory in the United Nations Charter. But if the people don't learn how to solve their disputes peacefully, how will they get the countries, the states, the big heads, and the rich people to be accountable for the way they handle their conflicts? We need peaceful resolution of disputes, top down, but also bottom up. So please pronounce yourself on how to improve peaceful resolution of disputes at all levels of society. Sorry if I've been a bit long.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we have the time for a second question. Yes, please, madam.
My name is Zainab Meborno. So speaking to the discussion in terms of the right voices being heard in the right, channels, I'm thinking about a bottom-up approach, one being African also, and I do work especially when it comes to conflict-related issues, so women and girls, amplifying the right voices. But when you do your work, you normally commission, consultants to go and do the work. How do you ensure that the right voices are being heard? What methodologies do you use? Because you need to make, what your own mission legible to the people at the grassroots level. And if you don't really do that, I think the aim is always defeated right from the beginning. So my question has to do with how do you ensure that the right voices are heard?
Thank you very much. A third and last question for this time. Yes, please, madam.
Hi, my name is Chang. I want to ask a question, I guess, regarding priorities. Because now that we're witnessing how the world is spiraling into recessions and a stagflation, my question, I guess, is how can we ensure funding for peace initiatives and peace-building activities, especially if countries are going to have priorities in the upcoming few years?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. So perhaps who would like to answer some of these questions? Yes, please, Adam.
I don't want to answer all of them. Zainab, I think your question is probably one of the most important ones that those of us who think about peace processes actually try and grapple with. And I want to put some of my colleagues on the spot. There's some of them sitting back there that are doing a project called Managing Exits from Armed Conflict. They have an event later this week. And part of their approach is to spend as much time as possible interviewing the affected communities when it comes to armed group reintegration and building a picture from those experiences. And I think it's a rare activity But one of the things I think we could be much more serious about when we're thinking about impact is to use what the population's view in a given setting is of the impact. We tend to think about programmatic expenditure and did you, complete this project? And I think one of the things, and actually Elizabeth in the PBSO, there has been a bit of a shift there where you could start thinking about much more population survey-based measurements of whether you're succeeding or not. And I think that would actually change a large degree the extent to which we can say something is successful or not, and then you prioritize based on that. So that's a very technical answer to a big political problem, but I do think that there's some scope there to actually make big shifts around that. But I think your question is a bigger one, and it's extremely hard. On priorities, just one quick point. The Institute for Economics and Peace came out with a really interesting report, which has to do with the costs globally of militarization and conflict. And I think that there's a really important value proposition around peacefulness that hasn't been well articulated by the UN. And small incremental reductions in the risk of violent conflict have huge economic benefits. Small reductions in militarization have huge economic benefits for G7, G20, and G77. And I think one of the things that we could really take up is to make that value proposition part of the surface conversation about peace work and make it less abstract. So in terms of prioritizing, I would actually say prioritize that value proposition, and your other priorities will fall into place underneath it. I don't have an answer for that impossible question you asked. Sorry.
Prince Zaid, you have the floor, and I also saw that Mrs. Pihar wanted to raise her hand. So please, Prince Zaid.
I mean, I completely agree with Adam on his last point. I think it's made all the more difficult, of course, with the Russian aggression on Ukraine. It's very difficult to convince countries when you had the Budapest Memorandum and a nuclear weapons state has ripped it up. The actual memorandum was deposited in New York by Sergei Lavrov himself when he was the ambassador. And so how do you convince countries not to up their defense spending given the climate? But I'd answer the point in terms of dispute resolution at a local level. I think for many, whether you speak of it at the level of family, siblings, community, society, state, and beyond, the critical part is the need to make small adjustments. Much of what we see happening is an overreaction, a human overreaction to contextual situations. The art of small adjustments is often the key to everything. And small adjustments is the world that we need to live in, this sort of the delimitation of reaction. The other point, I think, listening to everyone speak here, I completely agree with all the sentiments. The main problem we have in all these institutions is that the members are too powerful and the institutions too weak. Imagine a football game where you have the referee blowing their whistle and none of the players are listening. They're all fouling. They're all hoping to get away with it. They all hope the referee is weak, and indeed they plan to install a referee that's weak so that they can get away with it. The UN is the regulator of soft power, basically the depository of many of these conventions. And I think that essential power balance needs to be changed. It's one thing to talk about women and girls being included in processes, but then let's talk about Uyghur women and girls. Let's talk about Iranian women and girls. It's not thematically. Let's talk about the details. And not to be frightened by talking about the details. And then we can get somewhere. Thematic issues, yes, or by all means, but the hard, tough business of actually confronting states, whether it's on outer space, the SDGs, someone has to help them confront the vested interest within states that often stymie progress. If we don't do that, then we can keep talking and talking and talking, and it's not going to bear fruit, the sort of fruit that we want to see. But otherwise, I agree with everyone on this panel.
Yes, thank you. I'm just going to give the floor to Mrs. Pihar. Mrs. Pihar, yes, please.
Yes, thank you so much. And I apologize in advance. I'm going to have to leave as soon as I make my remarks because I have to chair another another virtual event, but this has been really extremely interesting, and thank you so much again to the organizers. Let me just try and provide a few thoughts on all three of the questions. First of all, in terms of how we can really work from the bottom up and make sure that we are strengthening internal peaceful resolution of disputes. Indeed, this is something that the UN, through various tools, is trying to support. So, for example, a big focus of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, together with the UNDP, is trying to help countries create national infrastructures for peace. Through the peacebuilding architecture, which thank you, Adam, for mentioning its potential, we have been working more and more on community-based approaches and definitely empowering local people for local dispute resolution. I'll give you just one example. In the Liptako-Gourma region of the Sahel, we have been investing quite a bit in supporting local conflict resolution, dispute resolution, to deal with farmer-herder conflicts, which are increasingly becoming an issue in that region. And climate change is exacerbating, in fact, the conflicts between those two particular constituencies. In terms of how we ensure that the right voices are heard, again, I think we need to go to the communities. There's a big movement now in terms of peace building and prevention on localization. We need to get to those communities. We need to hear them, and we also need to include them in everything we do from the beginning, that they help us and work with us to design support programs for them, monitor them, and obviously implement them. Adam, you mentioned the possibility of perception surveys and other sorts of tools to really hear from people. Absolutely very important, and we're going to try to incorporate that. This whole issue of learning from our work and what we do, which was mentioned several times in this panel, is incredibly important. In fact, one of the big emphases that I am placing within the Peacebuilding Support Office is how do we really work on this issue of impact? How do we understand it? How do we evaluate it? How do we learn from it? And in particular, how do we make what we're doing sustainable? And finally, in terms of financing, the issue of how do we fund prevention, peace building, and so forth, I just wanted to mention for those who aren't aware that in September, the General Assembly unanimously approved a resolution on financing for peace building, where they talked about a range of options and areas where we need to invest more in prevention and building and sustaining peace. And one of the things we're going to try to do as a UN system is to unpack that very rich resolution and see how we can leverage it so that we really do get the resources flowing to where they need to go. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Pirhar. And since you have to go, let me thank you for your participation today. And we hope that we will have you next year in person here in Geneva. So all the best. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Now I turn to you, Mrs.
Thank you. Just two quick points. When it comes to how we build peace, there's something we have forgotten, is coming back to education, éducation à la paix. This is something which maybe should come back in the agenda for peace. Most of the time, even the rhetorics that we find on the ground is not helping. Maybe putting this, teaching, coming back to what is peace, how do we understand peace in the same manner? How then are we going to support? Maybe starting from primary school, talking about peace building. Maybe the result of what we are going to start today, we'll see it in 10, 20 years. Éducation à la paix, teaching, coming back to that is really very important. But not only at some level, civil society. Today, when we talk about peace, you'll find this conversation at some point, but not at the political level. They have to be also accountable. They have their role in there. And then about the methodology that we use to make sure that the right voices are heard. First, to assess who is there? Who are the actors to go on the ground? Maybe in some places, DCAF is, we have country offices, but for countries where it's really, there's war, we work through institutions, which are sometimes decentralized. These are the ones we support. But also there are organizations which are locally that we try to support. The methodology is really first to assess who are there and who are those organizations we can find at a central level, but who are also present at the local level. They're supporting those ones to do the job where we cannot be able to deploy, and then empowering those ones. Coming back to the priorities and how we fund peace. It's really very sad to see that we have been talking about, Kofi Annan said there's no development without peace, there's no security without development. But today, when we look at the budget for the Sahel countries, you will find that the Ministry, Defense and Security, has between 17 and 20% of the national budget. But the Ministry of Justice will have 1% of the national strategy. So the national budget, where do we put? But to see also that the international community is coming with more and more weapons. Is this what we need? So this is also something we need to look into, to make sure that there's this balance. Who is funding peace, and what do we want to put there? If you look at Liptako Gourma, what is going there, Niger, Burkina Faso, Nigeria. So you see a lot of money going there, but where? What is the percentage of money which is there? But also seeing that even pressure is put on the countries to see that there is more and more budget on equipment building, but what is the, so this is something we really need to look into, who is funding what. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Putting peace at the center of the narratives, speaking about the details, not being afraid of speaking about the details. Thomas, what is your last word on this?
Well, just a brief comment on this very serious risk of crowding out all kinds of expenditures due to rapidly rising defense budgets. I think there are two things that I would advise us to do. Conceptually, we need to argue the comprehensiveness of security. This is, for you peace builders, something very normal. You know, this is also why we keep referring to peace and security. Unfortunately, this is not the case for traditional security constituencies, and they tend towards, seeing hard security, exclusively hard security, perhaps, combined with a bit of hybrid warfare, disinformation, cyber challenges, but the rest will receive absolutely no attention. So argue the case of the comprehensiveness of security would be important conceptually. And politically, I think we need to tell our security politicians to look at the repercussions of the war and tell them if they want to prevent the West against the rest, then they need to help the global South to deal with food insecurity, with energy insecurity, with tackling the challenges of climate change. If they're not going to do that, they will risk that these countries are going to turn the other way.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for these last words. This brings us to the end of this panel. Join me in thanking our panelists for their brilliant contribution.
And welcome, Volker, too.
should be there because she's leaving. c'est ouvert, le mic? No, I want to throw people out. Nicely, very nicely. Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you to take your seat? We will start in 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. Very happy to have you in this room. It's great to see you. You know, this is the week, the Peace Week that is starting today, with an amazing overarching theme. Peace is possible. You're just kind of wondering, why do they have to say that, right? In this time. And of course, if you look at what's happening around us or far away, I'm thinking about Ukraine, for example, Yemen, Ethiopia, or even Myanmar, you would say, yes, peace is really far from being possible, especially for the people and the community affected. At the same time, and we all feel that, and I think all of you here in this room, we feel that the time is exactly ripe to go for peace. But to do that, we have to look at our approach. We have to reflect about how we work together. And I think this session with this amazing panel that I will introduce very, very quickly, this session is really about how do we harness collaboration. There is an amazing set of people, of practitioners, of NGOs, civil society, both local and global, but also government, and a lot of different people that are able and willing to work. And I think we are reflecting about the power of collaboration and how to somewhat create a catalyst among all this different dynamic. And I think we have a great panel that will explore that, and we will explore that together. So let me just introduce our panel. This is from right to left. Yes, exactly, we can see. Ambassador Anna Jarfeld, very happy to see you. You are the permanent representative of Sweden here in Geneva towards the UN and international organization. What is interesting also, you were the director, you did a lot of things, but you were also the director of the Institute for International Affairs in Stockholm. So that gives you also a very interesting perspective. Welcome, very happy to have you with us. Ambassador Hans-Peter Jugel, we are very happy to see you here. You are the deputy permanent representative to the international organization and the UN in Geneva. And you were also, I was just looking at your amazing CV, you were also at a critical moment in charge in Germany for the balance between, I would say, common security, defense for European Union. So you've explored a lot of conflict and questions around that, and we are very happy to have you around. Sarah Meswadi, we are welcome here, very happy to see you here in Geneva. You are the regional officer for the Global Partnership for Preventive of Armed Conflict, and you are focusing on MENA region. Very happy to have you with us, and welcome. Iba, we all know you very well, but Iba Casastil, you are the director and you've done a lot of things, but today you are the director with us of the Principle for Peace initiatives, and you will have the chance to explain us a little bit more what is this initiative and how do we in fact want to focus on collaboration and catalyst. And Scott, we know also you very well, Scott Weber, you are the director of Interpeace. Very happy to see you here, and that's great. Last but not least, there is one person that is not in the room called Yasmin, and Yasmin is our, in fact, designer, and we've done that. Every time we do a meeting, we not only recall the question, do a memo and PVs, but we are also designing the dynamic and what happens. So at the end of the meeting, Yasmin, she can't be there technically, so she's just on the control room, watching us, listening to us, and designing, which will be interesting to see after an hour what she will capture from the discussions. And last but not least, I'm Yves Dacroix. I'm one of the co-chair of the Principle for Peace initiative, so very happy to be with you. Can we start with you, Hiba, maybe? Hiba, quickly, a few minutes to tell us a little bit what is, first I should ask, is peace possible, right? And especially when you look from the perspective of the last now 2 years where you've led, in fact, the Principle of Peace initiative. Hiba.
Thanks, Eve. And is this working?
No, it's not. It is.
Now it's working? Okay, great. Thanks, Eve. And I always say it's risky to ask a Palestinian if peace is possible, but in the current capacity that I have, I think the example of the Principles for Peace initiative and what we're going to see today, both on the stage, what you will see in the video, is a testament that actually there are enough ingredients to get us to come together and work towards peace. And I think what drove the Principles for Peace initiative and what gives it the fuel to go is actually three things, a combination. And the different combination varies from one time to another, but it's a combination of urgency, of fed-upness, and hope. And it's the kind of right cocktail of these three things. The urgency is really the fact that, and we've been discussing this quite a lot today and in many other sessions around where we are right now globally with the peace and security agenda, all the changes that occurred, high number of conflicts, all of that. But also the track record that we have as international community, which has been mixed. We've been a lot more successful to bring an immediate cessation to hostilities through mediation and political settlements, less successful in preventing conflict or sustaining peace. The fact that peace processes last around 7 years. And that kind of gives us a sense of urgency that we need really to rethink our approach. The sense of fed-upness is twofold. The fed-upness that is there amongst populations around the world. Those who actually feel that the potential even the basic tangible benefits, prospects to their lives is not really in their near future. But also all of those who actually have had the optimism of a peace process that have not fulfilled its promise, but seen that has not been fulfilled. But the other side of the fed-upness is among the practitioners. And this has really fueled this collaboration that we are talking about. And amongst policymakers who see also that there are areas, there's learning that we've had, but it's not necessarily translating always to policy and practice, and we see sometimes that we're repeating the same mistake. And hope is because despite all of the gloomy picture that we often focus on, but peace is happening in many parts of the world, and we've just got back from Southeast Asia, where there are a number of peace processes which continue to hold. We talk about Timor-Leste successful peace process, we talk about, even in the Philippines. Earlier today, we were talking about that as well. And policymakers and practitioners continue to try and build peace, and communities do as well. So this is what fueled this effort as a collective effort to try and come up with a set of principles, a common compass, a guiding framework.
For everybody, for all practitioners,
For all practitioners that would occupy somewhere between the Geneva Convention and the humanitarian principles in that space, and to be part of the calculus of decision makers, but that really builds on what we've learned collectively as a sector, that brings in a very strong sense of what evidence is showing us and what practice is showing us, but very importantly, that brings in the lived experience and the aspirations of the people. And that's why the Commission, which you're a member of and one of the co-leaders of, Eve, is a very important mechanism, but we very quickly realized that you can't be a group of wise men and women sitting in a room basing your findings on research, that your work needs to be anchored with a strong alliance of advocates and change makers. And that's what this effort has become, 120 organizations in the space coming together with great support from committed governments like Sweden, like Germany, but also Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Denmark, and many others, and bringing the academia, the practice, all together to try and shift, but also to build on what works and what does not work. And I think this is the beauty of this collaborative effort, that it's co-owned and it's not as usual. And a very good example is the person sitting next to me, Scott, where in Interpeace, as Secretariat, we're independent Secretariat, we're hosted at Interpeace. Interpeace gave, it conceived this process, but accepted and was very supportive of the idea that for this to succeed, it has to be a collective effort. Institutional ego needs to be put on the side, and it needs to be, the legitimacy of the Commission in this process is to be co-owned by the whole sector. And that's why they've been also supporting our independence and the way we operate.
Thank you, Iba. I can see, I have the chance to see the body language of the entire panel, and I see the body languages. You're ready to go. But before that, can I just introduce you quick? We will have a quick video because we wanted to make you hear some of the people that have been involved directly into this initiative. And we've asked them 3 questions, right? Why is peace possible? First questions. These are practitioners. These are people from Guatemala, from Syria, from very different places. B, why collaborate? And C, why do we need somewhat to unite around common value? We just hear them, and then we're back to the panel.
Cynicism can eat away at all our efforts, and yet it would be easy to take that route when you look at how many more conflicts there are going on in the world than there were just 10 years ago, when you look at the horrors of Ukraine and the fact that it looks as if it's going to continue, when you look at how many people are taking advantage of the fact that we are overly focused in one area, Ukraine perhaps, even though every bit of focus is essential for there. But what is even more essential is that we don't take our eye off the ball in peace elsewhere. And I think Principles for Peace is really important for that. Because one of the things that we really have to do, and this is essential to fight cynicism, is to show that those of us who are on the sort of front lines of pushing for peace are really are not doing it with a double standard.
Peace is possible as long we are sensitive and context specialized to each to each conflict and to each community and situation, because there is no one receipt of peace. So that's why it's possible. It's possible if we just look back to our community, our tradition, and we ensured our humanity. So that will make peace possible. And as long we have the breath in our lungs, so it's always possible.
If you look at the efforts that have been underway in places like Congo, Burundi, Sudan, South Sudan, places that have experienced chronic crisis, there's an awful lot of people today who are alive as a result of peace efforts that wouldn't be otherwise. The sacrifices that individual communities make, that women make, that traditional leaders make, to keep young men from joining armed groups, to keep their communities from mobilizing for war.
Yo creo que la paz es posible porque en la experiencia de nuestro país, la historia nos ha enseñado que sí se puede vivir en tiempos de paz, que también es un compromiso de todos y todas los que vivimos dentro de nuestros pueblos, dentro de nuestros espacios en donde nos desarrollamos. Es una construcción constante de todos y todas desde nuestros espacios.
Collaboration is essential because we can't say like who will apply peace, because peace is not applied by certain group to other groups. It's really an interaction between all actors at all levels, international, national, local, communities, men, women, girls, boys, everyone should be part of this.
Collaboration between all actors, regional organizations, the UN, member states, or non-official organizations. All of these need to collaborate, because tripping over each other in the attempt to bring peace somewhere is guaranteed to fail and essentially discredits us all.
Collaboration by all of us working together for peace is more vital now than ever. As a sector, we've grown, we've learned a lot, but we have to figure out how we can work together so that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. We need to work more linking the grassroots power to the political power, so bottom up and top down.
We really need motivation, first of all. And I think that the Principles for Peace initiative was really important in motivating different actors to take action jointly. The other thing I think that why this is necessary at this time is we really need to engage the unusual actors in this field. And I think the initiative is a good step in this direction. With the regional consultations, with local actors, local peace builders at the community level, organizations and actors from the global south. I find this really important because we're not going to achieve much by just talking among what we call as the usual suspects.
Reuniting around common principles and common values is so important because there are so many pieces to a peace process, and there are many stakeholders that have to get involved. And unless one is clear about the principles and the values that each side holds in common, it's easy to get distracted. It's easy to maybe get lost in the particular interest of one of the groups that may be more powerful, louder.
Es el hecho de que yo pueda tener esa conciencia de que dentro de este pluralismo existe una riqueza bastante importante que al yo aceptarlo y al yo reconocerlo como tal, mi sociedad, mi país, mi comunidad puede avanzar, el hecho de que pueda lograr una mejor calidad de vida, mejores condiciones de convivencia en armonía dentro del espacio en el que nos movemos.
And participating in an effort like the Principles for Peace is especially vital for us because it gives voice, it gives an opportunity for our colleagues around the world, our partners in the communities we serve, to feed in not only to what's happening within their own society, what's happening in Myanmar or Afghanistan or Congo, but also to talk about a global system that for all of the progress that we've made has still failed to deliver the aspirations that so many people who are most affected by issues of peace and conflict aspire to, which is sort of the same healthy, safe, and just societies that every human aspires to. And this partnership is a real platform to elevate those voices, but all of us to join in the common human struggle to think about how we can better solve our differences and move societies and our world forward.
All of us have been doing our things on our own here and there in a more isolated manner. So that's actually where the Principles for Peace initiative comes in, I think. And this is, for me, the most important thing that they were good at, bringing a wide network of peace builders from both global north and global south and motivating them to jointly do something, to jointly voice their vision and take action, and building consensus among them, illustrating some of these best techniques, principles that we developed in this field.
I do believe that this collaboration and Principles for Peace is a great mechanism for this, that it isn't just, but it's not just on the part of the actors themselves, the non-official actors, but the donor countries have a big role to play in encouraging that collaboration and in collaborating among themselves too, because it's a sensitive point, this.
The thing that gives me a hope, it's such platform which is locally engaged, globally connected. I think that's what we need, this connection. My call for action is listen to communities, listen to the creativity that's really happening on daily basis at community level.
It's really great to have all these people. Anna, I was watching you, especially at the end where Khada is saying, locally engaged, global connections. Some of the things we hear are things that you've heard already, all these years. First, before talking about specifically Sweden, I'm interested about you. How does that resonate for you, Anna? You that have worked and reflecting about peace and about all this kind of question.
No, thank you so much for inviting me, first of all, and I have to start by apologizing to say that I will very soon have to leave. But it's, I have to say, just watching this movie was really worth the time being here, I think, for all of us, because I think everything that was said in this movie is really the reasons why we found it so important to support this initiative from the beginning, because it is for countries like ours, who believe very much in the UN Charter, who believes in multilateralism. What we believe is that a sustainable peace must be inclusive, and I think this is why we are so happy also to hear and to support this initiative. And I think that concluding remark was really what it is all about. That if we are going to have sustainability when it comes to peace, we have to also involve the people who actually matter, and those are mainly the people on the ground.
I'm come back to you, but just I wanted to hear, Sarah, from let's say a local perspective, if I may say. How does that resonate, what you've just seen?
Okay, one sentence struck with me is that listen to the creativity that is happening on the ground, because usually what young peace builders are doing on the ground are really so innovative. They're doing peace building through arts, through music, through art street, through things that we don't even imagine. So sometimes a little bit of support, not even funding, sometimes even it's a little bit of motivation to give them, to feel that they are being listened to, and they will just unleash all that potential. So that's really a key sentence there.
Right. Hiba, just a word on what we've seen. Is there something that we need to take or that resonate specifically with you when you see it again?
You know, I mean, for me, this is a small section of the community that is really behind this effort. And I think what's so heartening about this is the fact that it's a display of the power of collaboration. That we could actually reach in less than 2 years over 61 countries, over 100,000 insights, over 700 pieces of research just distilled to kind of bring in some of the key findings. And that was only possible because we have 120 organizations involved and who feel ownership of this process and who are championing this. And I think this is also the spirit of International Geneva. You know, how do you actually create space for innovation and create a movement that brings in real society perspective, the power of practice, and the power of evidence, and bring in also the political feasibility and realpolitik consideration. So the combination of this is just very powerful.
Hanna, I would like to come back to you and to Sweden. Sweden is the country that was really at the beginning of that with the help of Germany and other countries, but really you were there at the beginning. And I think you decided to invest, right? Energy but also money. I'm intrigued about the idea of investing for collaboration. What is the role of donor country, if we talk about donor country or country that are also in favor of multilateralism in order to push collaboration?
No, I mean, as I mentioned before, Sweden being a big believer when it comes to multilateralism, we have also been it's also been always very important for us to invest in multilateralism in different ways. And I think these kind of collaborative notions, that is also very much the highlight and the focus of principles for peace. I mean, we have also seen it when it comes to women, peace and security agenda, for instance, youth, peace and security agenda. And I think these were two quite important examples for us that we looked at when we were asked to collaborate from the outset together with you. But I think it's also very clear today. I mean, we have, of course, a situation today when we look around the world where we are just seeing multiple crises everywhere. And if peace was an easy notion, I don't think we would see the world as it looks like today. So I think what we were trying to focus on and look into was trying to participate and collaborate and also invest in, as you said, financially, in an activity that could really reach out into so many countries, but also to connect connecting with so many different peace actors. I mean, it was donor countries like ours, but it's also local activists, it's women and youth-led organizations, it's people who have the capacity also to change things on the ground. And this was something that was very important for Sweden when we wanted to invest in this process. I guess the big challenge is also now where to sort of wrap this up, because of course I can imagine there are so many lessons and important processes that have already happened on the ground, but this is the notion of these principles for peace. What are those principles? And I think this is something that we are very much also looking forward to listening to you potentially on where we will end up, and will there be are there such a thing really as a principle for peace, or is it more action for peace? And I think this is going to be something that will be interesting to see for the future. But I think just to maybe one final point, because actually many of the points that I wanted to make had already been made by the people, much better so by the people who were on the small film. But I think what we were also open to was trying to look at peace through a different lens and try to see if there were possibilities to recalibrate and rethink and maybe reshift the discussions. And I think this is something that is maybe more important today than it's ever been before. But really, it's been such a pleasure also to have followed this process here from this Geneva perspective for the last 2 years, and I look forward to continuing this process together with you from this position. But with that, I will have to leave you. But I really thank you so much for inviting me, and it was such a pleasure to come.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the support, in fact, of you as a person, but also as a country, which is a very important one. Ambassador Jugel, I'm really intrigued, first to have your quick reactions about what you heard from the people. Does that resonate? What are the questions, or does that give you more strength or more envy even to invest and to push it, or how do you feel about it?
Oh, thank you very much. Well, a lot of reaction, actually. You have seen me so acting like that, and yes. First of all, I think the question was wonderful. Is peace possible? That's a good question, but the answers, they were great. So much optimism and so much motivated, and a lot of new creative concepts, and this is really convincing. And then referring to inclusivity, local communities. So this is a catchword, a keyword, which is really important. So this is what I'm having in mind. So you refer to my experiences in European civilian defense missions, actually. And this is what it is about, actually. You have to anchor every concept, actually, in the society. So this is a takeaway, so to say. And I like to be here on the panel because normally you are addressing the usual suspects. This was also a quote, so to say. But this is mixed, and there are only 2 representatives of governments, and this is important. So you need all stakeholders on board. But the decisive question is actually, and then I stop with my first reaction, is the how. Mm-hmm. So is peace possible, and the how?
Can I just, before moving on the how, I can see that we have some people ready to go for the how, but I'm also intrigued because you talk about the local community, but if we think also about, if I may, Germany, for example, if you would ask the questions to German people, is peace possible, when they look at what's happening close to their border, what would be their reaction?
You have to refer to that, because in these times, especially in Germany, when you see the aggression against Ukraine by Russia, if you see the attack on the international order, I mean, people have doubts in Germany. It's an attack on the international order, on the rules-based order, on the values, actually. So are we safe anymore? This is the question the people are talking about. And is peace possible? And I have to tell you, yes, especially in these times. And this is the amazing discussion we have in Germany, because on the one hand, you try to defend actually the rules-based order. On the other hand, you're thinking about concept. This cannot happen anymore. So this is even a trigger, so to say, for any peace deliberation and for principles on peace. But it's also the acknowledgement, actually, that in these times, you need a new approach. Mm-hmm. Okay, stop here.
Yeah, very interesting. Iba, I saw you reacting, and then I would like to ask also a question to Scott. Iba, because that's one of the questions. We're living in a time, the initiative was designed 2 years ago, right? And already based on a report that was saying that there's a lot of issue when it comes to conflict. The conflict are restarting systematically, and now we see each other 2 years later in a situation that seems even more complicated. But Ambassador, you're still saying peace is possible. I'm still intrigued by that, Eva.
You know, Eve, it's an interesting question, because in so many ways, more and more we find that when we're talking about why do peace processes potentially fail, with the current environment and the complexity of the environment, the default position is to talk about the context, the realpolitik, the geopolitik, the proxy and hybrid warfare, and all of these issues. But what we're finding out from this global process, that is true, but it's not the only cause. And what we see is that more and more, in many countries and in many places, peace processes can also fail on their own terms, because they're not broadly legitimate, because they're not seen as inclusive, and because they're not seen as transformative of some of the key drivers of conflict. And then that is all compounded when you add to it that when the communities feel that their aspirations, their needs are not addressed. You know, it's the tangible benefits. It's about the justice, inclusive governance, and security issues. And we've seen this even in some of the consultations we've done when we were in Bosnia 23, 24 years after the conflict, or in Guatemala, and you've heard from one of the congresswomen from Guatemala. And you see it as much when you're actually talking to communities or non-state armed actors in Mali. And there are some really scary trends going on around the world right now. And I think Sarah maybe can talk about that. It's also scary when we think that young people, for example, in the Middle East, in latest polls, 65% thought democracy doesn't necessarily translate into economic growth. And that's associated, for example, with the results of the Arab Spring. So we have a trend that is quite dangerous in a way that we need to counter with what's possible, with hope. And I'm very grateful for the support that Sweden and Germany and Denmark and others have been having. But Germany really have been at the very heart of this process, and bringing a very strong also political feasibility lens, which we very much appreciated throughout this process. We need to create incentives for more collaboration and shifting how we take this also forward.
Scott, and Ambassador, I'll come back to you. Scott, I'm intrigued about, you've been in the peace, if I may say, ecosystem for a very, very long time. You've seen a lot of things happening. Now when you listen to people talking about still their hope, as you mentioned, Ambassador, their hope and their somewhat creativity about peace, how does that resonate when you see that?
Thanks, Steve. Listen, it resonates enormously because, if you think about the crises that we are living through or have lived through, we've lived through political crises, economic, global financial crises, a massive pandemic health crisis, etc. Ultimately, if you look across all of those difficulties, what we have really faced and what we are facing at a deeper level is a crisis of trust. Crisis of trust in our institutions, a trust in our governance systems, trust in our economies, that they can be fair, trust in leaders, generally speaking. And there's a real breakdown of trust, which makes the rebuilding or the building of peace much more difficult than it ever was. And that's why partly this work is so important. But if you think about the impact of that, is that especially in the global south, there's a sentiment of unfairness that is pervading international multilateral affairs today, double standards, an unfairness that we have to address that is making collaboration much more difficult too. And I think one of the powerful things about this peace, Principles for Peace process is that, those who make the rules govern the rules, right? Well, this process has sought to rewrite the rules of peacemaking, but to do it in such a collaborative way that everyone was involved in drafting those rules. That's what's so powerful of this, is the commission that you've co-led has been a listening commission, has really engaged with so many communities around the world to invite them into the process of actually drafting what the rules should be for how we do this in the future. Because when you go and you work on the ground in these countries, and you cited Mali, Hiba, what do the Malians say to you? They said, this peace process that we had, that's not our peace, that's your peace. You did that for you, not for us. If it were for us, it would look very different. Think of Afghanistan. Think of the Doha process, which I would say is one of the most historically ill-advised peace processes I've known in my career. The Afghan people had no say in that. It wasn't their peace process. It doesn't even deserve the term peace process, frankly. So if we want peace processes to be truly owned and embraced, which is what we've discovered over 28, or in my case, 28 years, or in the Principles for Peace in the last 2 years of consultations, creates legitimacy, is people's sense of ownership of that peace. That it's not just the politicians getting together and writing their agreement with each other, but what about the social peace? How does this affect us, right? Everybody. That's what infuses legitimacy into a process. So by rewriting the rules, by getting so many different people involved, it's legitimated those principles that are going to govern action now, going forward, in ways that we've never seen. In my lifetime, I've never seen something like this in the peace space. So federating a lot of actors across the peace space has been great. Even more important, I think, has been the outreach that you've been doing to people who aren't in the peace space, communities and countries. That's where the real ownership is going to be. And ultimately, we are living in what, you know the term VUCA?
Yes.
Yeah?
We are a bit tired of it. But
you are? Well, yeah, but we're tired of it being VUCA, too. Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. That sounds like my morning. But we are living in an increasingly VUCA world, increasingly uncertain world, where we've lost our bearings. We've lost our bearings. We need something to help guide our action. And that's where, as Hiba said so rightly, the moral compass that's going to allow us to navigate these choppy waters. We need that's what's going to help us to actually, when everything's uncertain, everything's political, we don't have enough information, never have enough information to make good decisions. On what basis are we going to be making decisions? And the principles should provide that compass.
I really would like to, I'll come back to you, Ambassador, about the so-called new approach. But before, I would like to hear to you, Sarah. You have a responsibility for an organization. You're working very closely on the ground. You're also, if I may say, young, which is I don't know if it's an asset these days, but it looks like an asset. I really want to know, how do you see collaboration from your own perspective? Because we talk a lot about collaboration. You see a lot of people here, but I'm really intrigued. And what does that mean? Do you have example, reflection? How does that look like? Collaborating, right? Because we use this word a lot, let's be honest. I'm really intrigued. We're intrigued to know, how do you see that from your own perspective?
Thank you. So basically today I'm, of course, not just as a young peace builder from Tunisia, but I see myself as a team member of really a bold youth movement coming from all the MENA region. Bold movement of youth advocates, peace advocates, who are working to advance peace in their own definition. What is Arabic peace for them? What is Arab peace? And just 1 year and a half ago, we launched communities of practice, such as the Regional Network on Prevention of Atrocity Crime, the MENA Coalition on Youth Peace and Security. And what we have been doing is that we bring individuals and youth-led organizations, registered or non-registered, just people who are passionate about peace building, to really dialogue, exchange, share frustration, share ideas, and do collective action. Basically, from our side, what we did is just mainly 3 things, is that we try to empower through capacity building, but also micro grants, not only for well-known organizations who are well-structured, well-registered, but also for small, non-formal. Also protection, because in the MENA region, it's really important to really protect our young activists and provide them the tools. And finally, the learning and exchange, and it's important because we have regular learning sessions that the members themselves lead. It's not like the organizer of the team, and that we provide also spaces, discussion spaces with stakeholders like United Nations, donors, INGOs, and hence young people will understand these spaces, how to navigate them, and will, let's say, make their opinion voice up. And now what we see in collaboration has been really incredible, because in some cases, for example, with only a micro grant of €1,000, local members together in one country agreed to do a common project and reached hundreds of people with only that micro grant. And that's because each member brought his own expertise, his own resources, and his own network just to level it up, just to make it reach bigger and bigger outcomes. Another case is that now, currently, without even outreach, members are like, we want to host a learning session, we want to lead a session, or you see messages on WhatsApp and very simple communication tools like, oh, there is this grant opportunity, let's apply for it. Oh, we're looking for an expert in this topic who's interested. We have this new initiative who's interested to join. So imagine just creating a space and trying to strengthen, provide motivation, and provide strengthening capacity, and then suddenly different nodes of engagement emerge of young people agreeing all alone together. They just, you don't intervene, and they are like creating synergies, opportunities, and multiple things. Just one thing to highlight here is that we really discovered that young people actually do not like the silos approach or like single organization. They like to do the collaboration model, move beyond competition, because competition over funds has created a lot of problem. We see similar initiative peace building happening at the same country, at the same region, while they could have collaborated on doing it and making it bigger. And another important point is that instead of discussing and attacking these are global north standards and these are external stakeholders, that we called for co-leadership model. And that's why instead of just focusing on let's say funding, projectized funding, let's say direct impact, number of beneficiaries, or etc., we focus just on exchange and networking activities. So we just spend money to bring people together and talk. And that's what we did in Amman, Georgia, just lately. We brought with the support of the Swedish Institute, actually, and we just brought them talking with donors, INGO, UN. Just talk, and then we went to other organizations, well-known, governmental, and this has been the huge impact. Actually, we saw the huge impact in this, because when people have conversation and understand the other party, they will reach the common ground. So this is the thing, let the people provide the space, but then they will shape their own agenda, they will shape their own character. It's just the principle of, let's say, member-led. And this is not only through our network, like there is example of the GPAC, MENA Coalition, YPS, UNOI. These are really young peace-building organization promoting really the principle of member-led.
I like that a lot. Sarah, can I just ask a last question? What do you mean young is what, under 50 or what is the, no, I'm just joking. Not really, what is it, very young people or what does that mean?
So for instance, in the MENA Coalition YPS, we have from 17 years old to 35 years old.
Okay, that is a good, well tried. Ambassador, I would like to come back to you on both elements, on the collaboration. I mean, Germany is a country, and I've seen that your Minister of Foreign Affairs for a long time was able somewhat to bring, practitioners, academicians, also trying to bring them together, but it's also difficult, right? Because we have a lot of cluster of expertise when it comes to peace and security. So there is one element about that, but you also mentioned a new approach, and I'm intrigued. In a time you mentioned Germany has, over the last few months, for example, make some different focus, some different balance about security, for example. How do you see the balance between somewhat rethinking security and defense with, in fact, an initiative like this one? And what do you expect as a country, really, to an initiative like that? When you mention a new approach, I really like the notion of new approach.
Oh, that's a complex question, but I try to answer. Okay, first of all, we talked about here at questioning the existing concepts we have and to adapt and to have new ideas because of lessons learned. We have witnessed what can go wrong. I would like to go one step before, because it's also about the analysis. The analysis, why we have to reshape actually peace process. So in our analysis, first of all, and this is no surprise, we have more and more armed conflicts in the world since the Cold War. This is a fact, so we have to focus on that. Second, conflicts are becoming more complex. So they are more local at the one hand, but at the same time, they are also more transnational. And to add something more, they are more and more internationalized in this multipolarized world we are actually. Plus, and this belongs to the analysis, we also have the new phenomenon of cyberspace, cyber. So this is also something which affects peace processes when we talk about disinformation, what's going on in cyberspace. So we have to take that into account. And then the last element of our analysis, it's not only about armed conflicts, what we see. So we also see the climate crisis, actually. This is also an enforcer, actually, of conflicts. And we also have to address this in peacemaking concepts. It's environment, it's climate. So this makes it really complex, even the analysis, but this leads us actually that we have to reshape peace processes and that we have to have new concepts. And because of that, we need to have these principles. This is a new approach, and we are, really have to that. But the challenge is, and this refers to your questions, how to interpret it, so to say, how to connect, how to operationalize these principles. So this is a challenge. It's good that academia and research and all the institutes develop recommendations, but now the question is how to translate this into action. And this is also something Germany is focusing on. So we need a second phase, actually, for these principles. And bringing all the dots together in a network. And this leads me also to, we need to have a holistic approach. This balance between hard security, and nowadays more and more, especially in Germany, you talk about hard power, you talk about more military and so on. But at the same time, it is what we really want to try to do is to balance this with these principles for peace concepts. Because if you do not balance it, then there is no chance. And you need these concepts also for, to address the society, to see new concepts. And this is also in this whole conflict crisis. You have conflict prevention, you have conflict crisis, and you have post-conflict. So you need that approach, and that's why Germany and in our ministry, so I'm quite glad, we not only have a security policy division, we also have a stabilization division. It sounds a little bit like silos, but it's not, I can assure you. So we try to balance the two silos.
Thank you. I would like to come back to you, Iba. We spoke a lot about principle. Would you say a few words about, because that is really based on the reflections of people. And I just maybe want to say one word which comes from my own background. I'm coming from the humanitarian background. I spent 20 years. And one thing I really loved in the humanitarian ecosystem was the principle, the humanitarian principle, because it creates a possibility to account for, but also to discuss with very different stakeholders, from the people first one. You are impartial and neutral, let's talk about it. But you can also talk to a non-state armed group or government about what it means to have an impartial humanitarian activities. For example, I really would like you to say a few words about that, because Anna and Ambassador came back on that one. And how would an organization like Sarah's, for example, being able to benefit from the principle?
So maybe three reflections. One is in relation to something Sarah said, which is engaging new power. And I think it's been so powerful to see when we're having discussions with the non-usual suspects and with the different communities of practice, which is something we've been able to do in this process, not only with peace builders, not only with mediation actors, but also with security actors, with non-state armed actors, with religious and traditional leaders, with parliamentarians, with youth, with women, how sometimes the analysis on and the assumptions that underline intervention are actually very different. And one issue of a siloed approach is that when you're a hammer, everything you see is a nail. And when you're actually changing the canvas and you're bringing different actors together, the whole analysis takes a different dimension, which then brings me to something Ambassador also talked about in terms of the analysis of Germany now around the kind of shifts that we need to create. And I've mentioned earlier these three deficits that we see as common threads, the legitimacy deficit, the inclusion deficit, and the transformation deficit. It's very interesting to see from this whole global process when we're talking about, we're not going, actually, the findings are not polarities. It's not that we don't need political settlements or elite pacts, they don't work, so let's do something completely different. It's actually very realistic in saying what we need to do is actually recalibrate and complement. It's more than political peace that is needed, that allows peace to take hold. It's also social peace, it's economic, it's looking at governance, it's looking at different time frames. It's actually more than inclusion in the Western approach of how we understand inclusion in terms of the women peace and security agenda and the youth peace and security agenda. It's also the inclusion beyond the representation to looking at inclusive outcomes. How are the institutions, the hardware of society, the laws and the institutions, how are they also ensuring that we are shifting state-society relations? But the third very big shift that came out from this process is around the relationships between the externals and internals, the internationals and the nationals, and a very strong notion from the ground calling for not for the externals to see themselves as architects of peace processes, but to see their role more midwives of peace processes, supporting, which actually requires, in a way, a lot more humility, in a way, to see that you're actually accompanying locally led solutions that are more embedded, that are more owned, but intervening when there is a need for it. And some of the principles, that's why the principles as they emerged are now articulated in a Peacemaker's Covenant, which is meant to be a guiding framework for action, a doctrine, but not another toolbox, not a prescription, because this is anti what the principles stand for. The idea is really to be contextual, context matters, but actually to provide that common grammar, common frame of reference. So 3 key principles provide what we call the moral compass, which should infuse how we make decisions and act. And those are around solidarity, dignity, and humility, which are key to how peace processes are designed and what they deliver. The 4th principle is actually enhancing legitimacy. And that is our lodestar, in a way. It needs to be the lodestar in a peace process in terms of how the process is designed, but what peace delivers to the population. So enhancing legitimacy needs to be that lodestar. And then that is embedded also in a very strong and important foundation of inclusive security and accountable security. And the question of security is no doubt fundamental, but it has to be accountable. And then all of these are also complemented and embedded in actions and a partnership compact that promotes subsidiarity, that promotes pluralism, and that also embraces hybrid solutions. And what we mean there is that, context, history, and practical wisdom matters. So we can't always expect that we can transplant, a state institution of certain shape in a society that is not ready, but it's about the longer time frame of how we embed it in society and ensure that they own it. And then, of course, the question is, how do you then make this practical? The implications of this to different communities of practice would mean something different. The implications for mediation community and how they do mediation is different from how stabilization actors, security actors. So this is why we're thinking already, with the support of the coalition of the organizations that are this, and with the support of our partners and donors, is that the next phase is going to be about co-creation with the various communities of practice, the codes of practice and how this can be taken up. And this is where support of governments is very important, because there needs to be incentives for the uptake of these principles. They need to become part of the international system and infuse the work and support the work of the multilateral agenda in this space.
So in a summary, it's not a new organization, right, what we hear. It's a new approach. Now, it's important to mention that. That is creating a catalyst, really, through a possible principle, for example, that would allow not just organization, but also people and partner to understand what we're trying to do collectively, right? That's the notion. Scott, just a word on the idea of collectively and the catalyst nature of such initiative. Say a word on that one, and then I would like to ask then each of you to say a word, but just quickly on the notion of really not creating now a new silo. I really like the fact that we've spoken that, but really creating something that is truly not just collaborative, but brings somewhat an energy to the collective, right? Being it local or international.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The local people that we're talking about, and you, Sarah, you're a good example of that. You don't separate out the politics from the development, from the humanitarian, in your life. It's all interconnected, right? It's all part of your day, or your week, or your month. And I think the fact that what we are doing is touching on more fundamental and profound questions means that it doesn't fall in any one silo. It actually reflects how this lived in a profoundly integrated way in the lives of people. So I think that's the first thing that's gotten a lot of peace builders quite excited, is that it breaks us away from this siloed approach to how security is done and peace building is done from humanitarian, et cetera. We're actually regrounding it in the natural integration of how people are living it in these countries, because ultimately they have to build their own peace. At best, we on the outside, me included, need to be midwives or accompanying the process. Yeah, I'm happy to be a midwife if I can. But that's the point, is that they have to build their own peace. That's what we've learned over all these years works, is for people to build their own peace. They have their own solutions to their own problems. And so much of what we're trying to undo or unlearn is the arrogance of an outside world trying to impose its own frameworks on societies. Doesn't mean they don't have a role to play. Absolutely. I can say another way of saying that the work I've done over all these years has been really about trying to address this internal-external balance and trying to shift it back towards local actors. Not entirely saying everything's local, that outsiders don't have a role to play. That's not true, because as you say, the conflicts have gotten more complex, they're more internationalized. Outside actors have a role to play, absolutely. Local actors can't do it alone. But what's the right relationship, is the question. And on what basis of respect and respecting their dignity to drive a process themselves, not try to do it for them. That's why in the Principles for Peace, it's really rebalancing a whole bunch of things. It's rebalancing the short term versus the long term. Right? The real change is going to be long term. We live in a short term world, so how do we recalibrate, use the word recalibrate, how do we recalibrate what we're doing in the short term to go in the right long term direction? We need to recalibrate local bottom-up processes, which are always ignored, with the top-down ones. They both have a role to play. What's the right relationship there? We have to recalibrate internal and external actors, is another one. That could go on. There's 100 of them. But basically, it's about trying to get that balance better, get that balance right. And the principles are the guidance as to how to get that balance right. Because every context is going to be different, as Hibba rightly said. Everything is going to be urgent. Resources are going to be scarce. Hopefully we'll move to a collaboration, not competition. But what's going to guide us? And we haven't had that. We've been operating in a vacuum of real guidance on how to make those choices, create an outcome that is truly legitimate and embraced by societies.
Thank you, Scott. We're arriving at the end of this panel. I just would like still to hear, start with you, Sarah. Okay, you've heard a lot. We're speaking about collective, right, change and trying to catalyzing that. If there is one word or more than one sentence that you want to share with us in terms of almost call of actions, what would be?
Not one sentence, I'll try to be brief. I like the word inclusivity that Hiba said, because basically we don't just want to be consulted, we want to be partners and leaders in the process. And the fact to design and implement with us is amazing. That's what we want to look for. And the second thing is that give resources to people in that region, because I like the fact that you mentioned research. That's really incredible. For us, it's an amazing resource. But for us, for example, in the MENA, it's not easy to approach. Why is that? For instance, we don't have any peace curriculum in university about peace education. There are certificates, but there is no university that is public, for example, that teaches public administration, for example, public policy or peace building. So imagine the power of having that. And one final thing, just 11 years ago, there were a lot of uprising that you mentioned. That's so powerful. We believe that the revolution didn't end. It is continuing in many, many forms. So imagine if the same human rights movement that happened just 11 years ago, with the same power, we have a peace movement. People were educated to come up with a human rights movement. But if we have resources, we will come up with a similar peace movement in the MENA region, hopefully.
I like that a lot. Thank you very much. Ambassador, last word on your side. When you listen to all that, reflected about this reshaping peace process, as you mentioned, and creating this catalyst?
I still need to reflect about a lot what I've heard, so many interesting things. But let me start. What we need is this firm set of principles. I think this is where we can start. Then we can create trust, but also management of the expectations of everyone. I mean, this is not the one solution when we talk about the principle of peace. But it's a good start, and it's still a lot of work ahead of us, because now we have to translate it. We have to, as you said, actually, accessibility and communication is now important, and mainstreaming of the principles, so that we really can, at the end of the day, have all actors together and have this collective approach, because this is what counts.
Great. Iba, can I just ask you to do tough things for the last minute, just to watch at what Yasmin has done? Just, I don't know, it's quite interesting. You can choose maybe one element that you really would like to underline, and I think just to connect that with the fact that what is phase 2, you know, implementation and time-wise. What are you intrigued by?
I think we will also have this online for you to take a quick look at when you have a bit more time. But in a way, I think our discussion has been representation of actually the power of collaboration and collective action in a time that is much needed, as you can see with all the points that are underlying the urgency for us to rethink, to recalibrate, to kind of face the imperatives of this era. And we are getting there through a process of listening, learning, trying to capture what we've learned, trying to see where we can recalibrate, what we can build on, what we can break with, and where we need to create the movement. The principles for peace, as Ambassador just mentioned right now, is not the holy grail. Mm-hmm. It's actually a framework for action that is being articulated in this Peacemakers Covenant. We will be launching that at the end of the year, along with a follow-up mechanism, as has been discussed, to play a role of a catalyst to continue this process of co-creation in a participatory way, how we can move from ideas to practice, to shift incentives, to shift policy, and influencing as well, financing, that it actually becomes a lot more directed towards more legitimate and durable approach for peace, and directed towards what we've learned to have worked and what does not work.
Great. Iba, Sarah, Ambassador, Scott, thank you very much. That was a great panel. Thanks. Please join me. Great opening of our Peace Week. Please enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you. Well done. Perfect.